This presentation is a follow-up on our discussion of teaching alternative behaviors, and it deals with something called general case instruction. It would be more accurately called general case instructional planning because it has to do with planning how we're going to teach an alternative skill. It's especially useful for some students, particularly individuals on the autism spectrum, have a lot of difficulty learning to generalize skills. For instance, we may teach a communication skill or a social skill to a student in one situation, but unless we carefully plan for generalization, we can't necessarily expect that student to apply the skill in a different situation. The reason this usually happens is the person has learned some isolated behaviors or skills, but they haven't learned the environmental cues they need to attend to. So the skill is under stimulus control, we call, of a person's prompts or a teacher's prompts or cues, and it's not under stimulus control of naturally occurring events in the environment. If the person is going to be independent and learn to use the skill has to be cued by naturally occurring events. So it's important that we not only teach replacement behaviors, but we also have to teach the natural cues to which the student should learn to respond. General case instruction helps us do that. It's also important for a student to learn when it's appropriate and when it's not appropriate to use a particular skill. That concept should be introduced into the instruction very early. And for some students, again, particularly those on the autism spectrum or students with more severe disabilities, we may not even see generalization unless we plan our instruction very carefully. The steps to general case instruction have to do with first deciding where and when is a student going to use the skill. We use that to create a list of positive teaching examples. We call this the instructional universe. And not that it's supposed to sound cosmic or anything, but think of it in terms of mathematics. A universe is a collection of numbers that fall under a certain category. In this case, it's a collection of teaching examples. We also have to decide on what examples are we going to use. Selecting enough examples, positive examples, and a range of examples is very critical to teaching a skill so that it's going to generalize. So we call the examples the how and when part of the teaching. How is the student supposed to perform this skill, and when is it supposed to happen? Once we plan those aspects of instruction, then we can start teaching using the examples. And we have to figure out how we're going to monitor the student's progress. We need to measure whether or not the student's learning so that we can make adjustments to the way we're teaching if it isn't having the desired effect. In step 1, defining the instructional universe, we start with the information that we obtained from a functional behavior assessment. This is when we really put that information to good use. And this is really what it's for. If you've conducted a thorough functional behavior assessment, you have some invaluable information for teaching alternative behaviors. You know the function of the problem behavior. You know why it's occurring. You've also identified very specific situations in which the problem behavior occurs. Having this information tells you some really important things. First of all, we know what the student's motivation is. We use that to select an alternative behavior or replacement behavior that we discussed in the previous presentation. We also are teaching a skill that's going to be efficient. It's going to result in a payoff just as well as the problem behavior did. Or we have to figure out a way, at least for the short term, to make it just as efficient. And we know that it's functionally equivalent. It serves the same purpose. From the information we obtained from the functional behavior assessment, We look at those different situations when the individual is engaged in this challenging behavior. This is going to tell us when the person is motivated to get whatever the outcome is he or she's been after. For example, if the person is engaging in a behavior to get attention, looking at situations where that person is engaged in that behavior is going to tell us situations where the person is going to be motivated to request attention or request something else or use a social skill. From that list, we identify situations when it's appropriate for the person to use this communication skill. So in other words, when is it that we actually do want the person to use the skill? We also look at those situations and we find that there may be some instances where it's not appropriate for the person to use this skill. For an example, I'm going to refer to a student I worked with in the past. She was a young lady with autism. She was in an early childhood program. She had tantrums and some other challenging behavior around access to an art station. She would, if she wanted to use the art station and other children were there, she would engage in challenging behavior to try to get access. So the function of her behavior was to get access to the art station. We wanted her to teach her to request that activity appropriately. The idea being that using that communication skill is an appropriate way to get access to the art center that she wanted to get to. So we looked at situations where she engaged in this behavior, and we decided of these situations we listed in the functional behavior assessment, there were a number of them where it was actually appropriate for her to ask for the art activity. There were other situations when it was not appropriate, and we wanted to teach her eventually to not ask for it in those situations and to ask for it in situations where she should. So from the list of situations where she engaged in this behavior, she would push other kids out of the way, she'd fall to the floor, she would grab things and throw them. We looked at when we wanted her to actually use this request, and we used a picture request system with her. Then we had to decide at what point exactly were we going to prompt her to use this new communication skill. This is a little tricky, and timing is very critical here. You have to identify a point when the antecedent that occasions the problem behavior. And when I say occasions the behavior, it's really that the antecedent cues the behavior. So when the antecedent is present for the challenging behavior, but the student has not yet engaged in the challenging behavior. Sorry about the train there. You need to prompt the student to use this communication skill or whatever the skill is at that point in time. The reason you do this, you want that antecedent to become associated with this new skill you're teaching and not the challenging behavior. If the challenging behavior does occur, then you will redirect the student and continue the instruction, and you will not prompt the communication at that time because you don't want to teach a chain that includes the challenging behavior. In other words, you don't want the student to learn, well, first I see this, then I push things off the table, and then she's going to prompt me to request the art activity. That's not what you want the student to learn. You want the student to learn when this cue is present, it's okay for me to make this request. So after I have my list of positive teaching examples, in other words, my list of situations when it's acceptable for this new behavior to occur, then I want to come up with a list of negative examples. My negative examples are going to be a list of situations where it's not appropriate for the student to use this new skill. In both those instances, I want to sample a range of examples. In other words, I want to, if the challenging behavior occurs in different locations with different people, I want my teaching examples to be in different locations with different people. The reason for this is I want the student to be able to generalize ultimately to examples that I have not trained or not taught. So the basic strategy is whenever these situations are present, we're going to prompt the student to engage in this alternative behavior. If we were correct in identifying the function and the student gets the same outcome by engaging in the alternative behavior, we're going to see less occurrences of the challenging behavior. If you see the student is engaging in this alternative behavior and getting reinforced, and you still have the challenging behavior happening at the same rate, that means that either you were wrong in your hypothesis about the function or the behavior served more than one function. In either case, you need to go back and adjust your strategy at that point. After you have your examples set and you've decided when you're going to teach this new skill, then you actually start instruction. It's extremely important when you begin this, if you've identified the reinforcer for the problem behavior, you make that old challenging behavior not work as well. You have to find a way of limiting the amount of reinforcement that that old challenging behavior is going to get. And you focus on the new behavior getting reinforced on a richer schedule. In other words, you want to make the problem behavior inefficient and irrelevant and ineffective. And you want to make this new replacement behavior more efficient. You want to make it result in reinforcement more quickly and more easily and more consistently. That's what we mean by making it efficient, effective, and relevant. Of course, anytime you do an intervention, it's important to monitor the effect it's having on the student. This is going to let you know if your intervention's working or if you need to go back and do something differently. It is not effective to keep doing interventions that are not working. That's actually one way to demoralize people so that they're not implementing strategies, is to require them to keep doing stuff that really isn't having the effect that it's planned to have. At a minimum, you need to collect data on the challenging behavior. You need to know if it's decreasing. And you need to collect some kind of data on the new alternative behavior that you're teaching. You need to start some data collection before intervention, because unless you have some kind of baseline measure, you have no basis of comparison. You don't really know if this behavior is changing as a result of your intervention. Usually you can use data you already have. If you've conducted a functional behavior assessment, then you can use the ABC or the FADO observation form to gather frequency data. Really what you're doing with the FADO is, if you're using the system correctly, you're counting the frequency of behaviors under different circumstances. Sometimes you need data different than frequency. If, for example, one of the outcomes is on-task behavior, then you want either duration or momentary time sampling data as a basis of comparison. If you're collecting frequency data, it's usually pretty easy to just do a continuous recording or record instances that happen throughout the day. If you're using something like momentary time sampling or duration recording, that is not practical to do all day long, every day. In those situations, it's usually a good idea to do probe assessments, or 2 or 3 times a week for a certain time period you'll measure something like on-task behavior, or measure the extent to which the student uses some kind of replacement behavior. Another example would be if the replacement behavior is a social skill and something that requires more intensive observation, you would plan to observe at specific times, and you do it the same way a couple of times a week, and this gives you a way to monitor progress. If you're using something like permanent products, in other words, if homework completion was the issue, then it's a lot simpler because the work the student's producing is your source of data. So decide how you're going to measure the challenging behavior and the alternative behavior, and come up with a plan that's so that you're going to be able to consistently collect some data. Consistency here is the key. You want to be able to compare your data across time. One of my favorite phrases is never require anyone to collect any kind of data that she or he is not going to personally use to make some kind of decision. You'll hear me say that a lot. Whatever data you collect, graph it on a regular basis. Graphing enables you to visually analyze any changes or the absence of changes that are occurring in your student's behavior, and allows you to make adjustments as needed. I mean, basically, you want to look at your data. Do you see any clear trend lines, or do you simply see that the behavior is continuing as it is? Do you see your challenging behavior decreasing? If you don't, something needs to happen differently. Either that behavior is still being reinforced, or the replacement behavior is not serving the same purpose. Of course, is the replacement behavior increasing is another question. If that's not increasing, then probably it's not the correct behavior, or it's not efficiency. It's not efficient. It's not resulting in a payoff as well as the challenging behavior. So you either have to make the challenging behavior more efficient, or you have to make, you either have to make the alternative behavior more efficient, or you have to make the challenging behavior less efficient. Sometimes you can't make this replacement behavior work better. You're simply doing, the demands of the environment are such that the payoff is about as good as it's going to get. Then you have to make the challenging behavior not work as well. Ideally, you do a little bit of both. You make one work better and one not work as well. It's a good idea to have some goal in mind as to when you expect to see a certain level of change. It's a point of reference, and you can decide, okay, by the end of 2 weeks, we're going to evaluate this. If we don't see a significant change, then we're going to do something different. Sometimes a peer comparison is a good point of reference. For example, if I'm teaching a student, if I'm interested in a student participating more in class, and I want the student to ask more questions or make more comments, I can randomly pick a couple of peers and I can briefly measure their level of contribution. I can compare my student to their level and see what kind of discrepancy I have. Another point of comparison is look at the demands of the next environment. For example, if you're working with kids in elementary school, you can look at what would be required in middle school, and you can use that as a goal or a reference point. Other kinds of questions you need to ask yourself: does the student have adequate opportunities to practice this new skill? So if it's a communication skill or a social skill, do I need to create some teachable opportunities so that I can prompt the student to use the skill and reinforce it? Also, look at the level of fluency the student has with this new skill. How well is the student doing it? Do I need to change the skill? Do I need to provide more instruction? Do I need to provide more prompts and cues? Look at the amount of assistance the student needs to use this new skill. What level of prompting is required? What kinds of prompts? Do you have an adequate means of fading those prompts and assistance? You should see the level of assistance the student needs decreasing over time. If you don't, it means that the student's still relying on cues from an adult and is not learning to perform the new skill in response to more naturally occurring environmental cues. Sometimes you need to take a look at how you're going to transfer that cueing from an adult to a cue in the environment. Sometimes you have to use some very well-planned prompt fading procedures like time delay prompting or most to least prompting. In instances where students have not learned to respond to natural cues, often the problem is we are not being proactive. In other words, we are prompting the student after some kind of escalation or challenging behavior started to occur. In order for a student to learn to use a skill independently, we have to prompt him or her to use that skill before some kind of challenging behavior occurs. So sometimes we actually have to plan a certain number of opportunities. We might say, okay, during this activity, we're going to prompt the student to learn to use this skill 4 different times, and we're going to do it in these situations. Sometimes you have to be that specific. So going back to my earlier example of the young girl who was engaging in challenging behavior to get access to the art activity, we actually had to plan that during a morning activity or stations kind of exercise, she was going to get prompted to make this request 4 times within a 1-hour period. And we were also going to identify situations where she was not going to make this request and teach her when this is present, you can make the request. When this is present, it's not appropriate to make the request. So based on the functional assessment information, we have to decide which of these 4 types of instructional situations are we dealing with. Is the student engaging in a behavior to obtain access to something, or is the student engaging in a challenging behavior to escape and avoid something? If the student is engaging in a behavior to obtain access to something, what is the student trying to get access to? Is the student trying to get access to attention? And is it attention from adults or attention from other students? Is the person trying to get access to help or assistance? Does a challenging behavior frequently result in someone restructuring or redirecting the student or providing some kind of help? Or is it access to something tangible, like a certain object or an activity or a game or an event? In our example, it's an actual activity that the student's trying to get access to. The more specific information, obviously, about the function of the behavior, the more focused our instruction can be, and the more likely it's going to be successful. Whether the student is trying to get access to attention, assistance, or some kind of item or event, the way that we would teach the communication or alternative skill is very similar, and we'd follow very similar steps. The first thing we do is we identify the instructional universe. In other words, what are the situations in which it's appropriate for the person to use the skill? We call these positive examples, and they represent our positive stimulus case. So in the case of our example, the teacher indicates that it's time for everyone to choose centers. That's one situation. Or Alice is given free time and she has the opportunity to choose an activity. That would be a second situation. Or Alice is finished with an assignment and she's waiting for another activity to begin. Or she's at home and she has time to choose an activity. These would all be appropriate and acceptable times for her to request the art activity. So this is our positive stimulus case, or they are positive teaching examples. In addition to the positive stimulus case, we've also identified situations where it's not appropriate for Alice to make this request. These were also situations where challenging behavior had occurred. So negative examples would be she's taking a turn at a center and the art center's full, so you can't request the center and get access when it's full. Or it's not time for any student to be at centers. The students should be engaged in something else. Or if she's given directions to participate in another activity, or if she's preparing for a transition to go to lunch or some other activity. These would be cases in which if she made the request, she would be told, okay, I see you want to go to art, but now the art center's full. So we have to come up with how we're going to teach her to respond to those situations as well. This is a step that very often is left out with teaching alternative behaviors, and it's why many interventions are not successful. Taking the extra time to plan out these positive and negative examples can have a huge impact on the success or failure of an intervention. So when we plan out the instruction, we list the instructional universe in one column. What are the teaching examples? In another column, we specify the appropriate response that we want the student to make. And then we provide a rationale. These are more notes for ourselves. So in the situation where the teacher indicates that it's time for everyone to choose centers, that's an appropriate time for Alice to ask for art. And it's appropriate because this is a time that she can make choices, and she's making an appropriate choice. We also identify situations where it's not appropriate for her to make a request. Let's take another example where we're teaching a student to access attention appropriately. So this would be a situation in which our functional behavior assessment indicated that the function of the challenging behavior was to get access to attention. We'd use a similar teaching profile from the previous example. A number of years ago, there was a really interesting study by Northup and colleagues. There were 3 students with ADHD, and they had out-of-seat behavior and inappropriate vocalizations that happened during instructional times. And the indirect functional behavior assessment was not conclusive. In other words, it sort of indicated that it could be teacher attention and peer attention. So the authors of the study did an environmental manipulation. They created some conditions that tested out if the behaviors were maintained by peer attention or teacher reprimand. So the way they did this was kind of interesting. They actually did some small groups, and they had other kids. They prompted them to attend and say things when the kids got out of their seat or did vocalizations. Like the other kids would say, "Hey, you're not supposed to be out of your seat." I thought that was kind of interesting. And then in another condition, the teachers actually reprimanded the kids every time they got out of their seat or had a vocalization. So they actually tested out peer attention versus teacher attention. And what they found was for these kids, it didn't really matter if the teachers responded to them, but the reactions of the peers did have an effect on their behavior. So back in the classroom, they put together an intervention that the students earned free time with a peer for being in their seats. And they actually would teach them to appropriately ask to do things with peers as well. So this was the alternative behavior. And then the peers, they actually reinforced them for ignoring the 3 students when they were out of their seat or made vocalizations. So they used a group contingency. And we'll talk more about group contingencies later, but they used an independent group contingency, which meant each individual student was earning reinforcers or not based on their behavior. But it was really a cool study because they used a reinforcement plan for the peers so that they would prevent them from reinforcing the kids with challenging behavior. And it was extremely successful. Another really interesting study that dealt with access to attention was by Skinner, not B.F. Skinner. This is another Skinner that's at University of Tennessee. He used a DRL, which is differential reinforcement of low rates of behavior, and a dependent group-oriented contingency. Dependent group-oriented contingencies are really cool. You don't use them often, but in some situations they work really well. In this type of contingency, the whole class earns a reinforcer based on the performance of an individual student or a small group of students. So it works really well if you have a class that is where other kids are affecting the behavior of an individual student. This particular student was a 13-year-old boy with behavioral disorders, and it was a self-contained classroom for kids with behavior disorders. They did a number of functional behavior assessment measures. They did the motivation assessment scale and the probable behavior questionnaire. They indicated that the behavior was maintained by attention. The scatter plot showed that it happened pretty much throughout the day. And when you looked at the ABC data that collected, it did show that peers laughed at the disruptions of this little boy. So the ABC data, as well as the other indirect measures, indicated that the challenging behavior was maintained by peer attention. For the intervention, they used the DRL and the dependent group contingency, and it was really creative. A DRL, or differential reinforcement of low rates, is a good intervention to use when it's not a dangerous or real serious behavior, but it's just happening too often. It's one of my favorite interventions. So with this intervention, if he had no more than 2 intervals of disruptive noise during the day, he got to play a game with the class at the end of the day. He got 2 to 5 minutes to make all the other kids laugh. So he could do whatever within reason. They specify some boundaries, but he was doing things to get their attention. So within this time period, he could do these different things, try to get the other kids laughed. He couldn't use inappropriate language or be disrespectful, and he could not touch the peers. If he got everybody to laugh, he would win. If even one person didn't laugh, then the class would win, and then they would earn different points. The intervention was very effective, and they were actually able to eventually stop the game. They got his academics to increase, and his noise making and everything went down to really low levels. It didn't go completely away, but it certainly was improved to the point that it was no longer a big issue.